The night was cold enough to freeze a man's breath in mid-air. Snow covered the small cabin like a thick white blanket. Inside, James sat near his fire, rubbing his hands together, trying to keep warm. He had not expected visitors this far from town, especially not in the middle of winter. Then it happened. 3 faint knocks on his door. They were not loud, not urgent, but weak. As if the knocker barely had the strength to lift a hand. James frowned, his mind racing. No one came here unless they were lost or desperate. And in this weather, either could mean trouble. He stood, grabbed the old hunting knife from the table, and moved to the door. The wind howled outside, snowflakes slipping through the cracks. He pulled the door open and froze. Standing in the snow was a tall, thin, alien woman, her skin pale blue under the moonlight. Her clothes were torn, and in her arms she held a small child wrapped in what looked like scraps of cloth. Her lips trembled as she tried to speak. "One meal for my child," she whispered, voice shaking. Then her knees gave way, and she collapsed face first into the snow. The child stumbled forward, grabbing James's sleeve with tiny fingers. Eyes wide and pleading, for a heartbeat, James just stood there, unsure. He had heard stories about alien refugees passing through the mountains, running from things they would not speak about. Helping them could mean danger, but leaving them out here meant certain death. Without thinking further, he sheathed the knife and bent down. He lifted the woman's thin, cold body, surprised at how light she was. The child followed silently as James carried her inside. The warmth of the fire washed over them, and steam rose from the snow, melting off their clothes. James laid the mother down on a blanket by the fire. The child knelt beside her, touching her face gently. "She's breathing." James muttered to himself, relieved. He took a pot from the shelf and filled it with water from the bucket, placing it over the flames. He knew they needed heat, food, and time to recover. The child's large, dark eyes followed every movement he made. James tried to smile, but the child only stared. Clutching the scraps tighter, when the water was hot, James poured it into a cup, then tore a piece of bread from his small supply. He offered it to the child first. The little hands trembled as they took it. The first bite was tiny, careful, as if afraid the food might disappear. James felt something twist in his chest. A low moan came from the mother. Her eyes fluttered open, the pale blue irises focusing slowly on him. "You helped us," she whispered, her voice hoarse. James nodded. She glanced toward the window, then back to him, a shadow of fear crossing her face. "They'll come looking," she said weakly. Before coughing, James hesitated. "Who?" he asked, but the mother only shook her head slightly, as if saying the name would bring danger faster. Her gaze drifted to her child, who was still eating quietly by the fire. "I just wanted him to live," she murmured, eyes closing again from exhaustion. The fire popped and crackled outside. The wind roared through the trees. James sat down on a stool, watching the 2 strangers he had just let into his home. Something about them told him this was no simple case of lost travelers. The mother's clothes had strange marks burned into them, symbols he didn't recognize. Her wrists had faint red lines, like old rope burns. The child's thin frame spoke of many days without food. James felt the weight of the decision he had made. If whoever was hunting them came here, he might be putting himself in danger. But as he looked at the child curled up next to the mother, his mind was already made up. He would not turn them out into the snow. Hours passed. The mother slept fitfully, sometimes muttering in a language James didn't understand. The child finally lay down, still wrapped in scraps, and drifted into uneasy sleep. James added another log to the fire, glancing toward the door every now and then. He couldn't shake the feeling that eyes might already be watching from the forest. By midnight, the snowstorm had grown worse. The cabin creaked under the wind's weight. James sat with his knife in hand, the firelight casting long shadows on the walls. He didn't know what trouble had found its way to his doorstep, but one thing was certain: this night was only the beginning. When morning came, the storm outside had not stopped. The snow was piled high against the cabin walls, blocking half the window. James stirred the fire back to life, the orange glow pushing away the night's chill. The mother still lay wrapped in the blanket, her breathing slow but steady. The child woke first, blinking sleep from tired eyes for a moment. There was confusion then. The memory of safety seemed to return, and the child sat closer to the fire. James handed over a small bowl of porridge he had made from the last of his oats. The child hesitated before eating, glancing at the mother. As if seeking permission, James gave a gentle nod. And only then did the little one take the first bite. Not long after, the mother's eyes opened. She tried to sit up, but winced. Clutching her side, James moved to help her, propping her against a pillow. "You're safe here," he said softly. "For now." Her gaze flickered toward the window as though she didn't quite believe the words. "You gave us food," she whispered. Her voice was stronger now, but still hoarse. James nodded again. "You asked for one meal for your child," he said. "I couldn't say no." The mother's eyes lowered. And she let out a slow, tired breath. "I didn't want to come here," she said quietly. But there was nowhere else. James pulled a chair closer and sat down. He studied her face-sharp cheekbones, eyes deep with worry, skin that seemed to shimmer faintly in the firelight. "What happened to you?" he asked, keeping his tone. The mother's jaw tightened, her gaze shifting to the child, who was still eating slowly, as if trying to make the food last forever. Finally, she spoke. "We were workers in a mining camp, far from here," she began, her voice trembling at the memory. "They called us workers, but we were slaves." James felt a cold knot tighten in his chest. She continued. "We dug for metal, day after day, with little food, less water, and no rest." Her hands clenched the blanket. "If someone got sick, they were left behind, buried under the dirt, forgotten." She paused to steady herself, then looked directly at James. "They wanted my child to work too," she said, her voice breaking. James frowned. "Your child's too small for that." "They didn't care," she whispered. "The smaller ones can crawl into places the adults can't reach. And many never come back." The fire cracked loudly, the only sound for a long moment. James felt anger boiling in his veins. "So you escaped?" he said quietly. She nodded. "Yes. But they will come for us." Her voice dropped to a whisper. "They always come." James leaned back in his chair, thinking. Her story was true, and he had no reason to doubt it then. The mercenaries who controlled that camp wouldn't stop hunting them. "What about your people?" he asked. "Is there no safe place for you?" The mother's expression hardened. "My people are scattered. Broken by war, sold to the mines, traded like property," she said bitterly. "The few who remain free, they are too far to help." James looked toward the child again. The little one had finished eating and was now sitting quietly, small hands curled around the empty bowl. James reached over, took the bowl, and ruffled the child's hair gently. The child didn't flinch, but there was a sadness in the eyes that no child should have. The mother shifted, pulling the blanket tighter around herself. "Why did you help us?" she asked suddenly, her tone both curious and suspicious. James shrugged slightly. "Because someone should," he replied. "Because I couldn't just watch you die in the snow." Her lips curved into the faintest of smiles, but it vanished. "Almost immediately, you've put yourself in danger," she warned. "If they find us here, they will not spare you." James met her gaze steadily. "I'll take my chances," he said, outside. The wind howled again, a reminder of the hostile world beyond the cabin walls. The mother's eyes softened, but there was still fear in them. Deep fear that had been there long before last night. Hours passed as the storm raged on. James repaired the firewood pile and boiled more water. The mother rested, though sometimes she muttered in a language he couldn't understand. The child followed him around quietly, curious but shy, when night began to fall again. The snowstorm finally started to weaken. James looked out the window. White silence stretched across the forest, but in the far distance, against the fading light, he thought he saw a movement, a small dark shape slipping between the trees. Too far to make out clearly, he shut the window shutters and locked them. The mother noticed his change in expression. "They're here, aren't they?" she asked in a low voice. James didn't answer directly, but his grip tightened on the hunting knife at his belt. That night, James couldn't sleep. Every creak of the wood, every gust of wind made him glance toward the door. The mother and child slept close to the fire, the warmth keeping the cold at bay. But James knew warmth wouldn't protect them from what might come, and he had the sinking feeling that tomorrow someone would knock again. The morning came quiet, but it was not a peaceful kind of quiet. It was the heavy silence before something bad happens. James stepped outside to get water from the barrel, his breath turning to mist in the freezing air. The forest seemed to still, and the snow crunched under his boots like broken glass. When he turned back toward the cabin, he saw them, 3 figures walking slowly through the snow, their heavy boots leaving deep marks behind them. They wore thick black coats, but the glint of metal on their shoulders told James they were armed. The tallest one carried a strange long weapon slung across his back. The others had belts full of strange tools and blades. James's heart sank. He didn't need to ask who they were, he already knew. They were here for the mother and child. He walked back inside calmly, though his hands were cold with more than just the winter air. "They're here," he said. Quietly, the mother, sitting near the fire with her child, froze. Her eyes widened in fear, her thin hands tightening on the blanket. "Hide," James said firmly, moving toward the old trapdoor in the corner of the cabin. He lifted it, revealing a dark space beneath. It was a narrow hiding place used years ago for storing grain. "Get in, both of you, and stay quiet," he whispered. The mother hesitated, but when she heard the crunch of boots getting closer, she nodded and climbed down. James lowered the trapdoor and covered it with a rug. He took a deep breath, forcing his heartbeat to slow. Then came the knock this time. It was loud and heavy. Shaking the wood of the door, James opened it just enough to look at them. 3 alien mercenaries stood there, snow on their shoulders, their faces hard and unfriendly. The leader's voice was deep and cold. "We're looking for a runaway female and her offspring," he said. They were last seen heading this way. James leaned on the doorframe, keeping his face neutral. "Haven't seen anyone," he said. "Just me out here." The mercenary's eyes narrowed, scanning the inside of the cabin over James's shoulder. "It's cold," James added. "You'd better keep moving before the storm returns." One of the others stepped forward, sniffing the air like an animal. "She's close," he said quietly to the leader. "I can smell her." James's grip tightened on the door. "I think you're mistaken," he replied. The leader gave a slow, cold smile. "Mind if we take a look inside?" he asked, though it didn't sound like a question. James knew he couldn't stop them by force, not yet. He stepped aside, letting the leader and the others enter. They walked slowly, their boots thumping on the floorboards. One of them tapped the walls with his hand, listening. Another lifted a pot from the shelf, sniffed it, and set it back down. The leader crouched near the fire, picking up a thin piece of cloth that had fallen to the floor. It was part of the blanket James had given the mother. He held it between 2 fingers, studying it with a knowing. "Look, this isn't yours," he said flatly. James shrugged. "Found it in the forest days ago." He lied. The mercenary didn't seem convinced. He stood and looked James in the eye. "If you're hiding them," he said, his voice low, "and dangerous, you're signing your own death." James didn't flinch. "I'm not hiding anyone," he replied. "You've searched. Now be on your way." The leader studied him for a long moment before turning toward the door. The others followed, but not before one of them looked back and smirked. "We'll be back," he said. "The snow keeps tracks, and we know how to follow them." When they were gone, James closed the door slowly. He waited, listening to the sound of their boots fading into the forest. Only when he was sure they were far enough did he move the rug and lift the trapdoor. The mother climbed out first, clutching her child. Her breathing was fast, her eyes wild. "They know," she whispered. "They'll come back." James nodded grimly. "They'll come back, and next time. They won't knock first." The child clung to her leg, looking between them silently. James looked out the window. Their tracks in the snow were already being covered by the wind. But the mercenaries were skilled hunters. Snow wouldn't hide them for long. He turned back to the mother. "You can't stay here," he said. "If they return and find you, it's over." Her lips trembled. "Where can we go?" James thought. Of the old forest trails, the hidden places only locals knew. There was one in particular, an abandoned mining tunnel deep in the woods. Far from any path, it wasn't safe. But it might be safer than staying here. The mother's eyes searched his face. "You would take us?" she asked softly. James nodded. "I'm not letting them take you back." Outside, the wind began to rise again, carrying the faint sound of voices far in the distance. The hunters were still near. Time was running out. The sky was a pale gray when they left the cabin. James carried a small pack with bread, dried meat, and a flask of water. The mother held her child close, wrapping him in the blanket as tightly as she could. Her eyes kept scanning the trees, as if expecting shadows to move. The forest stood silent under its heavy coat of snow. Each step James took crunched loudly, too loud for his liking. He kept glancing behind, searching for signs of movement. The mercenaries were good trackers. He had no doubt they were following. They moved along a narrow trail, barely visible under the snow. The trees rose like tall, frozen guards on either side. The air was so cold it felt sharp in the lungs. James could feel the child shivering against his mother's chest. After an hour, the path grew steeper. James offered to carry the child so the mother could walk faster. She hesitated, then nodded, gently passing the small boy into his arms. The child clung to James's neck, his thin fingers icy even through the gloves. "You hold on tight," James said softly. "We'll get you somewhere safe." The mother kept close to his side, her breath coming in small clouds. She moved with quiet determination, but every so often, she glanced back. James knew what she was thinking. They were being followed. He didn't need to say it out loud. The truth was heavy in the air. A sound broke the stillness, a soft hum, mechanical, faint but growing. The mother froze, her eyes widening in alarm. "They've released the trackers," she whispered. James tightened his hold on the child. "What trackers?" he asked, though part of him didn't want to know. "Small machines," she said quickly. "They float. They smell the air. They see heat." Her voice shook. "They don't stop until they find you." James scanned the treetops, and then he saw a small glint of metal moving between branches. It was no bigger than a bird, but its eyes glowed red. Scanning, searching, move. James said sharply. They left the trail, pushing into deeper snow between the trees. Branches scraped at their clothes. The snow was deeper here, slowing them down. James knew it would only be a matter of time before the drone spotted them. The forest began to change. The trees grew closer together, the ground dipping into a shallow valley. James led them toward a half-frozen stream. The water was slow, almost still. With a thin layer of ice along the edges. "Step in," James said, lowering the child to the ground. The mother looked at him like he was mad. "It will hide our tracks," he explained. The water was painfully cold. But they moved along it for several minutes. Each step was a shock to the skin. But James knew it was working. The snow no longer held their trail. The drone's hum grew faint, then vanished entirely. Only when they were sure it was gone did they step back onto solid ground. The mother was shaking from the cold, but she didn't complain. Her focus was entirely on keeping her child safe. By midday, clouds rolled in, making the forest darker. James spotted a narrow gap between two hills, a hidden way that few would know. He led them through, stepping over fallen branches and ducking under low limbs. Beyond it, the forest opened into a clearing. At the far side was the mouth of a tunnel, half covered by snow and overgrown roots. "This is it," James said quietly. The mother stared at the dark opening, her expression unsure. "It looks dangerous," she said softly. "It is," James admitted, "but no one comes here. It's our best chance." They stepped inside, and the sound of the outside world faded. The air was colder, damp, and heavy with the scent of earth. The tunnel stretched into darkness, the walls rough and jagged. James lit a small lantern from his pack, the weak glow pushing back the shadows. They moved deeper until they found a spot where the tunnel widened slightly. James set down the pack and motioned for them to sit. The mother lowered herself against the wall, pulling the child into her lap. He was exhausted. His head resting against her shoulder, James handed her some bread and water. "Eat," he said. "You'll need your strength." She accepted it, but didn't eat much, giving most to her child. Her eyes met James's in the dim light. "You didn't have to do this," she said quietly. "You could have let us go. Or turned us away." James shook his head. "I'm not the kind of man who lets a child starve," he replied. For a moment, silence settled between them. The mother's eyes glistened, but she looked away, as if not wanting him to see. Somewhere far in the forest, a faint echo of shouting carried on the wind. The hunters were still out there, and James knew it was only a matter of time before they got close again. He checked the lantern and his knife. "We'll rest for a bit," he said. "Then we move again before dark." The mother nodded, her arms tightening protectively around her child. In the shadows of the tunnel, the sound of their breathing was the only thing keeping the darkness from feeling alive. James didn't say it out loud, but he knew the truth. The real danger hadn't even reached them yet. The tunnel was colder than the forest outside. Moist air clung to their skin, and every sound seemed to echo too loudly. James held the lantern high, its weak light flickering against the jagged walls. The mother stayed close, her child pressed against her chest, the blanket pulled up to his chin. They moved slowly, careful with every step. Loose stones crunched under their boots, and sometimes water dripped from the ceiling. The smell of damp earth mixed with something metallic. James wondered how long this place had been abandoned. "This tunnel used to lead to the old silver mines," James said quietly. The mother looked around, her voice low. "And no one comes here now." He shook his head. "Not unless they're desperate." She gave a faint, tired smile. "Then we are in the right place." After a while, they reached a wider section. An old wooden beam crossed above them, blackened with age and rot. James set the lantern on a flat rock, lowering his pack to the ground. "We'll rest here for a short time," he said. The mother sat against the wall, her back straight. Despite the fatigue, the child was already half asleep, his small head resting in the hollow of her shoulder. James took a piece of bread from the pack and passed it to her. She shook her head. "You eat? I'm fine." James replied, "He needs you strong." After a moment, she accepted it and began to eat in small bites. For a short while, It was quiet, except for the sound of the wind outside. Faint through the tunnel's mouth, but then a distant noise made James freeze. It was soft at first, a low hum. The mother's eyes widened instantly. "The tracker," she whispered. James grabbed the lantern and motioned for them to move. Deeper into the tunnel, they walked faster now, their breaths coming in short clouds. The hum grew louder, bouncing off the stone walls. Somewhere behind them, faint red light flickered against the tunnel's entrance. The mother clutched her child tighter. James glanced back once, just long enough to see a small, hovering machine gliding into the tunnel. Its glowing eyes scanned the walls, the ground, the air. "Go," James urged, his voice low but urgent. They reached a narrow passage where the walls closed in. James squeezed through first, helping the mother pass the child to him before following. The tracker's hum grew sharper now, more focused. The sound of metal against stone told him it was scraping against the tunnel to get through. They pressed on until the air began to feel heavier. The lantern's light revealed wooden support soles and cracked, holding up the roof. "Stay quiet," James whispered. They ducked under one, the wood groaning softly under its own weight. The tracker's sound suddenly stopped. James frowned, turning his head to listen. Then a new sound came: boots. The kind of boots that didn't care about being heard. They found the entrance. James muttered. The mother's breathing quickened. "Then we have to go deeper," she said, her voice trembling. James nodded. But his mind was racing. He knew the old mine ahead could be dangerous. Parts of it could collapse, and there might be no way out if they went too far. Still, they moved forward. The tunnel sloped downward now, the air colder still. James kept his knife in one hand, lantern in the other. Every step away from the surface felt heavier. But going back was not an option. They reached a fork in the tunnel. One path seemed wide and safer, but the air smelled stale. The other was narrow, winding and sloped upward. James chose the narrow wind might lead to an exit farther away from the hunters. As they walked, the mother spoke quietly. "You risk much for us," she said. "Why?" James didn't answer right away. Finally, he said, "Because I couldn't live with myself if I let them take you back." Her eyes glistened in the dim light, but she looked away quickly. Then, from behind them, came the sharp crack of wood. Breaking, the sound of voices echoed down the tunnel, low, harsh, and getting closer. James turned off the lantern, plunging them into near darkness. "Hold the wall and keep moving," he whispered. The mother obeyed, holding her child with one arm and guiding herself with the other. They moved in silence, the cold stone damp under their fingers. Somewhere behind, the mercenaries' voices grew louder. A faint red light began to glow on the walls again. Another tracker, or maybe the same one. James's mind raced, looking for an advantage. The path began to narrow again until James saw a break in the wall, a small side tunnel, half hidden behind fallen rocks. "Inside," he said, motioning quickly. The mother hesitated, but followed. They crouched low, crawling through the narrow gap until they were completely hidden from view. In the darkness, they waited. The sound of boots came closer, then stopped. The glow of red light passed by their hiding place. James held his breath until the sound began to fade again. Only then did he let out the air slowly. "We can't stay here forever," he whispered. The mother nodded, her voice just as quiet. "But if we go now, they might hear us," she said. James agreed. "We wait a little. Then we move again." The child stirred in her arms but didn't cry. James felt a strange swell of respect for his courage in the cold, dark tunnel with danger so close. The boy stayed silent, a silence that might be the only reason they were still alive. The tunnel stayed silent for a while. James could hear only the sound of their breathing. Slow and careful, his hand rested on the knife, his eyes fixed on the dim light of the lantern, which he kept covered to hide their position. The mother sat with the child in her lap. The boy's small head pressed against her chest. Then a sound broke the stillness. Sharp metallic click. James's heart sank. It was the sound of a weapon being readied. The hunters had stopped moving, and now they were listening. James whispered. To the mother, when I say go. You take the child and run toward the narrow path we passed earlier. She stared at him, her eyes wide in the dark. What about you? I'll keep them busy, he said firmly. You just run and don't look back. Her lips parted as if to argue, but the faint echo of voices cut her short. The mercenaries were speaking in their rough, guttural language, the words bouncing. Off the stone walls, the glow of a tracker light began to sweep the tunnel again. It was coming closer. James knew they had no more time. He crouched, grabbing a heavy piece of rock from the floor. With his other hand, he kept the knife ready. The mother tightened her hold on the child. Her trembling barely visible in the shadows, the first mercenary appeared at the bend of the tunnel. The red glow of his visor lit up the darkness. James didn't wait. He hurled the rock with all his strength. It smashed into the man's head. Knocking him sideways against the wall, the tracker above him buzzed and swerved in confusion. Go! James shouted. The mother bolted, clutching the child, her steps quick but silent. The second mercenary raised his weapon, but James lunged forward, slamming into him before he could fire. They both crashed to the ground, the weapon clattering. Away, the tunnel erupted with shouts. The third hunter rushed forward, swinging a heavy blade. James rolled aside just in time, feeling the wind of the strike pass his face. He grabbed the fallen weapon and swung it upward, catching the attacker in the chest. Pain flared in his shoulder as the first mercenary recovered and struck him from behind. James staggered but didn't fall. The mother's footsteps echoed faintly. Growing more distant, she was getting away. That was all that mattered. The hunters pressed forward, forcing James back toward the narrow section of the tunnel. It was harder for them to fight in the tight space. But it also meant he couldn't retreat quickly. The second mercenary snarled and charged. James sidestepped, slamming him into the jagged wall. The man cried out in pain, his weapon dropping into the dirt. James kicked it away, but the third hunter was already upon him. They locked in a brutal struggle, their boots grinding in the dust. James's arms shook with effort as he pushed against the man's strength. Then he twisted suddenly, driving his knife into the gap between the man's armor plates. The hunter gasped, his eyes wide, and collapsed. James pulled the knife free, turning toward the other two. One was bleeding heavily, the other was raising his weapon again, but before the shot could come, the tunnel ceiling groaned. James realized too late that the fight had weakened the old supports. A loud crack echoed through the space, followed by the rumble of shifting rock. Dust rained down from above. The mercenaries froze, but James moved. Shoving one back into the widening collapse, the tunnel roof came down in a roar. James was thrown to the ground, the air knocked from his lungs when the dust began to settle. The way behind him was sealed with a wall of rock and debris. The mercenaries were gone, buried under the collapse. James coughed, forcing himself to his feet. He could barely see through the haze, but he heard a faint sound ahead. It was the mother calling his name, her voice echoing from the darkness. James. He stumbled forward, his legs heavy, after what felt like forever. He saw them, a dim shape in the faint light of the tunnel's far end. The mother rushed toward him, still holding the child. "You're hurt," she said, seeing the blood on his arm. "It's nothing," James replied, though his vision swam for a moment. She gripped his hand tightly, pulling him along. "We have to keep moving," she said. "There might be more." James nodded, his steps uneven, but determined. The boy reached out and touched his shoulder lightly, as if to say thank you, without words. They pressed on until the tunnel began to slope upward. James's breath was ragged, but the faint smell of fresh air pushed him forward. the darkness slowly gave way to a pale light ahead. They were close to an exit. The pale light at the end of the tunnel grew brighter with every step. James felt the cold air brushing against his face, carrying the scent of pine and snow. His body ached, his arm throbbed where the blade had cut him, but he pushed forward. The mother stayed close, the child still in her arms. Though the boy's eyes were now open and alert, finally they stepped out into the open. The tunnel's mouth opened onto a ridge high above the forest. From here, the snow-covered trees stretched for miles. And in the far distance, faint smoke curled from the chimneys of a village. The mother's eyes widened, her voice barely a whisper. "Is that safe?" James studied the distant roofs. "It's not perfect," he said. "But the people there don't ask questions if you work hard and keep to yourself." The mother tightened her hold on the child, the wind catching the ends of the blanket. She looked at James with an expression that mixed relief and disbelief. "You're really taking us there?" she asked. He nodded. "If you still want to go?" The child, who had been silent for most of the journey, reached out a small hand toward James. The simple gesture made something tighten in his chest. He took the boy's hand gently, and they started down the slope. The snow was deep in places, forcing them to move slowly. James kept scanning the forest for any sign of movement. The collapse in the tunnel might have stopped the mercenaries, but he couldn't be sure. Every now and then, the mother glanced behind them, as if expecting shadows to follow. Hours passed before the first signs of the village came into view wooden fences, stacked logs, and faint trails of smoke. A few villagers were chopping wood outside, their heads turning as James approached with the strangers. One old man stepped forward, squinting. "Back already, James?" he asked, and with company. James gave a small smile. "They're with me." The old man looked at the mother and child, his gaze lingering on their worn clothes and tired faces. "Plenty of work here," he said simply. "If you're willing." The mother nodded quickly, her voice soft but steady. "I'll work." The villagers didn't press for answers. They simply opened the gate and let them in. James led them to a small, unused cabin near the edge of the village. It was old but sturdy, with a working fireplace and a roof that didn't leak. "This can be yours," James said, pushing the door open. The mother stepped inside. Looking around at the empty room, the child wandered to the window, peeking out at the snow-covered hills. Her voice was trembling when she said, "It feels safe." James brought in some firewood and lit the hearth. The flames quickly filled the room with warmth. The mother stood near the fire. Holding her child close, she looked at James, her eyes shining in the flickering light. "You didn't have to save us," she said quietly. "You didn't have to bring us here." "I know," James replied, "but I wanted to." Her lips curved into a small, genuine smile. "You are now part of our family," she said softly. "Where we go, you go," for the first time in years. James felt something he hadn't known. He was missing belonging. He had lived alone for so long, keeping the world at arm's length, but now, with these two standing beside him, the cabin no longer felt like just walls and a roof. It felt like home. That night, the snow fell gently outside. The village was quiet. The only sound, the crackle of the fire. The mother sat by the hearth, the child asleep in her lap. James sat in the chair opposite her, watching the flames dance. She broke the silence with a soft voice. "I used to dream of a place like this," she said. "A place where no one can take him away from me." James looked at the boy, sleeping peacefully for the first time since he'd met him. "Now you have it," he said, "and no one's going to take it from you." The mother's eyes softened. She reached across the space between them, her fingers brushing his hand. "You've given us more than safety," she said. "You've given us a future outside." The wind whispered through the trees in the distance. The forest where they had run still stood silent and cold. But here, Inside the cabin, the air was warm and filled with a new kind of peace. James knew the mercenaries might still be out there somewhere, but he also knew that whatever came next, they would face it together. And for the first time in a long time, he was ready.